low expectations. And the research seems to show that teachers interact much more positively with students with whom they have high expectations than those for whom expectations were low, which, you know, that might be kind of common sense, but we might think that's not really that surprising. I suppose the thing to think about, though, is how much of that are teachers aware of? How much of that are we aware of? Are we self-aware of the way we are interacting with different learners, and what might be influencing those beliefs and those interactions that we have? And we're going to be thinking a little bit later about the importance of reflection. And so you might want to think back to that particular issue. In addition, the researchers found that interactions with those for whom expectations were high were often more academically supportive in fostering learning outcomes, whereas interactions with those for whom expectations were low were less conducive to improving academic outcomes. So now we're getting into a cycle, either a virtuous cycle or a kind of declining cycle, with these beliefs and actions interacting with each other. And not so much a circle, I suppose, as a spiral, upwards or downwards. So overall, the findings suggest that when students are in the classes of unbiased teachers who do not differentiate in how they treat high and low achievers, the differences in achievement between students are reduced compared to if they are with biased teachers or with those who treat high and low achievers very differently. In addition, when teachers have high expectations for all students, achievement will likely increase substantially. So the differences appear to be quite substantial as these two researchers put together the impact that have been measured in previous research. These attitudes, these expectations, these beliefs, these actions based on teachers' expectations and prior beliefs, they do have a major impact on outcomes, both positively and negatively. So the researchers conclude that students in the classes of high expectation teachers make large academic progress and improve their self-beliefs, which is really interesting. Conversely, students with low expectation teachers make very little academic progress over 1 year and their self-beliefs decline. Those things go for students generally. Kashika et al. In 2023, they explored issues around the notions of learning disability and that kind of label. So if children are given a label of disabled or learning disability or some other kind of notion of special education need, what kind of impact does that have on them? And again, often teachers have lower expectations of pupils and learners with these kind of labels. The researchers said that explicit naming of the diagnosis appears to play a special role in the context of teachers' expectations. For example, they cite the work of Thelen et al. In 2003, who investigated the influence of special education labels using vignettes with students with particular descriptions such as learning disability or emotional disturbance, and students without any label. So it was the same, they gave the same vignette, but with some vignettes they gave a label, and with other vignettes they didn't add a label. They found that when the fictitious students were labelled, teachers' behavioural and academic expectations were lower than they were for the non-labelled counterpart. So really, really important as we consider our own practices, but also as we consider the practices of those around us in our settings, and particularly for those of you in positions of leadership in this field, perhaps your Elencos or senior leadership team, you can see how important it is that we shape the atmosphere and the interactions within our settings to try and improve those relationships and those statements of relationships between teachers and the learners, And one thing that Hattie's work revealed was that actually we can influence practitioners to have more positive beliefs and attitudes. So these things are not necessarily fixed. So that's a really interesting and positive message to take away, that people's attitudes and beliefs and practices with regard to attitudes, interactions, etc., they can be changed for the better. So something a relatively, I say relatively easy. It's not necessarily an expensive, let's put it that way, in terms of resource and time issue to raise. It might just be that the particular member of staff is not conscious of what they're doing. So raising that consciousness can be really important. Okay, so Di, can you go back to the PowerPoint, please? I'll stop sharing this. There we are. Okay, lovely. Gosh, I see we're running short of time. So we'll do this really quickly. I thought this was interesting. This researcher, I think he's German, so it's Entrich. He did this study of understanding cross-national differences in inclusive education coverage. So we've started off by thinking about a very local, personalized example of what might influence inclusive education coverage by thinking about our own attitudes. Entrich's work looked much more broadly at those kind of much more structural issues. So he came up with 4 hypotheses which he tested to investigate the influence on inclusive education coverage in particular countries. He looked at 52 countries. So his first hypothesis that the economic resources of a country would be influential, highly influential on a country's response as to whether they were more or less inclusive. He examined the hypothesis that the education system structure would be influential. So was there a high stratification? In other words, lots of different types of settings and lots of external government guidance and direction as to what schools should do. And we talked this morning, didn't we, about those kind of standards, expectations, and the impact of exams set not within the school, but from externally to the school, what impact those have. So that's high stratification towards low stratification, where schools are much more similar amongst themselves, but also are able to make more of their own decisions. Another hypothesis was that of political conviction. So he looked here at countries who ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities soon after its production in 2006, and those who kind of waited a long time. And he wondered whether that was an indication of the willingness of a nation to become more or less inclusive. And then he looked at the notion of classification of special education needs. So the percentage of the whole school population that gets classified as having special education needs. What is the impact of that on building a more inclusive system? So those who tend to have a high percentage as identified as having special education needs, and those who have a lower percentage. So I'm not going to go into a group again because we're running very short of time, but what I'd like us to do is a thing called a chat blast, a little bit cheesy, and you may well have done these sorts of things back in those wonderful days of COVID. I want you to have a think and get ready to post your response, but hold on your posting in the chat until I give you the go ahead. So I'd like you to put what you think is the most influential factor here on a country being more or less inclusive, and what is the least influential. just so the one at the top and the one at the bottom. So if, for example, you thought that H2, the structure, was the most important, and H3, political conviction, was really not that important, you put H2 first and H3 after it. So I'll give you just 1 minute to have a think about what you think is the most important and what is the least important of these particular factors, and pop them in your chat, but don't post them until I go 3, 2, 1, blast. Okay, so 1 minute. One minute doesn't give you enough time to ask ChatGTP. I hope. Not that any of you would ever think of doing that. Well, no, don't post yet. Don't post yet. Don't hit that post button. No, don't post. Haven't given you the permission to post yet. Hold your horses. Okay, so 3, 2, 1, blast off. Yeah, don't worry. We won't take marks off you for posting early. Thanks, Emma. Oh, look, somebody's done a whole ranking there. H4, 1, 2, 3. Okay. All right, great. Thanks. So we've got a consensus. H4 most, H1, H2, H2, H1, H1, H2, H4, H2. Okay. H2s, H2s. All right. So let's have a really quick, we're going to whiz through this at a rate of knots because we're running very short of time. So yeah, Di, can you bring up the, that's it, lovely time. And move on to the next slide. So findings. So economic resources, which was H1. Contrary to assumptions, and well done, most of you avoided this. In fact, some of you said this was the weakest thing, and you would have been right in that. Contrary to assumptions, higher income and educational expenditure may not significantly increase inclusive education coverage, because inclusive schooling can reduce costs compared to maintaining special schools. So we shouldn't just assume that because a country is richer than other countries, they are more likely to be inclusive. Okay. H3, political conviction. So was early ratification of UN CRPD and its optional protocol, did it signal stronger commitment to inclusion? Possibly, but the correlation is really weak. So it's not a strong correlation. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay. This is interesting. So pupils identified as having SEN as a percentage of the total school population. So you can see at the left-hand end there, Iceland, Lithuania, Estonia, etc., etc. They had relatively high identification of SEN. If we flip to the next slide, now you won't have time to look at this in detail. But what this points out is that there is a correlation between high identification of special education needs and high rates of inclusion. So some of these countries here that had very high identification of special needs also have higher rates of inclusion, which might go a bit contrary to kind of common sense. You might think, well, if they're so obsessed about SEN, maybe they won't be so interested in more inclusive practices. But what the author postulates is that if attention is being paid to these pupils, then that seems to indicate that countries are more likely to think carefully about how they can then be included. Okay, we can zip on. Great. So the impact there, greater recognition of SEN equals greater inclusive education. There is a decisive connection between the inclusion rate and general belief in importance of special education needs. However, stigma is a very important issue, and this goes back to our original discussion in terms of those beliefs and thoughts with regards to children with some sort of special education needs. So if a particular disability or learning difficulty is very stigmatizing within a particular context, within a particular country, then that is a great challenge to the inclusion of those learners within the education system of that country. Okay, I'm going to ask you, Di, to yes, if you could pop through to the next slide. Oh, sorry, one back. That's it. Yeah. So structural issues. Inclusive education coverage is less dependent on economic resources, as we've said, but it's more dependent on the extent of differentiation between schools within an education system. Less different. When we're saying differentiation here, we're not talking about this morning's differentiation of lessons and assessment and so forth. We're saying differences between schools and differences between different routes through education. So some education routes, some ask pupils to think very carefully, even at a very young age, about what they want to do, whether they want to go down a more academic route or whether they want to go down a more vocational route. I say ask pupils, often the system will decide for those pupils. So I think it's changed a bit now, but in Germany that was done at a very, very young age. So those systems which differentiate between future outcomes for pupils, they are less likely to have more inclusive systems, which kind of makes sense. Again, if there's external pressure that mainstream is for the average learner, then that's going to be detrimental to inclusive practices. And also there's an impact of the effectiveness or the perceived effectiveness of existing special education systems. So if there is popular support generally for the special school system, then clearly that makes it more difficult politically, policy-wise, to move towards a more inclusive system. Okay, so just some kind of general findings there. And if we just advance the slides, because I'm aware I've basically run out of time. From there again, you can go and revisit these slides. The next one on again, please, Di. And again. Okay, so you can think about these things in terms of the Welsh context. So what are the kind of push and pull factors towards working towards more inclusive practices? So we do have an education system where, although power is being divulged to schools in terms of thinking about the curriculum and teachers being able to make more decisions on behalf of the learners that are in front of them, or at least in theory, there's still high accountability. Schools are categorized, there's lots of testing, different types of schools, and perhaps crucially, we're still reliant on external exams at the age of 15, 16, and then 17, 18 as well. So those are demonstrated in the research there to be drivers towards less inclusive systems. Okay, you're welcome to go back and have a look at those particular points, and I would definitely recommend that you explore these two papers that are referenced here. You just pop to the last slide, Di. Oh no, well, that's it, great. So those references are there. I forgot to put up the references for the teacher, the work on teacher expectations. I'll pop those into the chat in a short while, so you can follow those up if you wish. I've gone a little bit over time, beg your pardon. but hopefully that kind of whistle-stop tour of some of those factors, both at a kind of macro level and a more micro level, gets us thinking about some of the issues we need to discuss and think about when we're trying to explore how we might improve inclusive practice. Okay, thank you very much.